Breaking news flashed across the screen. There had been an incident. A man in his 40s was arrested for kidnapping and imprisoning a child. Black police cars were parked outside the house, surrounded by an open field. The victim was confined in this rundown warehouse for a staggering 12 years. People were gathered on the lawn as they rushed in to attend to this issue. The police had successfully detained the suspect on charges of kidnapping, confinement, and labor law violations. This news was reported all over television as breaking news, and it was covered by many headlines. For the sake of privacy, the arrested suspect was allowed to wear a face mask as the police led him past the crowd that gathered to take pictures. The media was, of course, desperate to get a nice scoop on the news. They wanted to know if the perpetrator knew the victim personally before committing the crime. They also asked important questions like who was the first to report the crime, while the police dutifully tried to push them away from the door. The poor victim was showing signs of hearing and speech impairment. This made the authorized suspect that the perpetrator was aware of this beforehand when planning the crime. They'd been able to cut through the lock where the poor victim had been confined, and they opened the door of a dark room to see stacks and stacks of books. When they were rescued, they found that the warehouse had been flooded with countless books, and seated on that mountain of books was a youth who was still trying to read in that dark room. Law enforcement reached out to their captain immediately, informing them that they had indeed found the poor, haggard-looking victim. Based on the severe injuries on his body, it was presumed that the poor boy was subjected to long-term abuse. The victim, who was nicknamed A, was transported to the hospital and is currently reported to be in stable condition. Reporters were, of course, not allowed inside as they worked to stabilize the poor victim. Some of the media tried to protest and say that they were hurt, so they also needed medical treatment. Shin Woo-jin was 18 years old. They had finally confirmed the victim's name. The youth was suffering from intense malnutrition and multiple external infections. The bright-eyed, beautiful youth was adorable as he stared into the bright light for the first time in a long time. The doctors could not imagine how someone could hurt a beautiful child, which was a bizarre choice of words, because it's not like an ugly child deserved that either. The poor boy had been locked up and forced into labor for 12 years. The youth had also suffered from hearing loss as he had not been exposed to sound for a long time. The doctor sighed and took notes of this bizarre situation. She wrote down a question and showed it to the boy, asking if he could say his name out loud. The boy stared at this question, taking it in, and she encouraged him to try saying his name. The boy finally opened his mouth to speak, repeating words that he'd probably heard all of his life. He declared that he was, in fact, a bastard. That was a rather dark response and not at all what the doctor had been going for. Well, the sun continued to shine brightly in the sky, and a rather suspicious-looking individual was about. Oh. It was just a farmer working in the hot sun and protecting their face from blisters with a bat and a face covering. While this one person toiled, a lazy man sat and watched. This seemed to be the youth's memory, and he remembered being tossed dry rice with vegetables every once in a while. The boy would scarf down the food with his hands, desperately eating like an animal since he was treated as such. Every time they opened the door, the person who fed him would call him a bastard, saying that he ate so disgustingly. The poor child was always cold during the winter because a draft would drift in from the closed windows, and he would shiver in the cold. Sometimes, when the boy was so desperate, he would even grab a roach. Hopefully not to snack on, but it was quite likely that he was snacking on it. Back to the present, the doctors were horrified by the poor youth's words, and they were rather shocked, speechless, unsure what to say to such a declaration. They were sure this was the effect of brainwashing, and they'd also found countless scars on the poor kid's body. This child had definitely suffered a lot of abuse all this time. Those monsters who'd done this to him should surely all be sentenced to death, in her opinion. However, all in all, this situation was at least a relief. The medical results were not as bad as they had feared, but the boy seemed jolted by her honest smile and kind touch. He was safe now, so he could sleep as much as he wanted in a warm bed. The doctor tried her best to communicate that he was safe and that she would soon be back. The other doctor asked if he should take care of the kid, but the female doctor assured him that she could take care of the boy by herself. The doctor managed to step out of the hospital room and ran into a huge crowd of desperate reporters who were still trying to get a good news scoop and were drilling the doctor on all sorts of questions. They wanted to know the patient's condition, and if his family had been found. They also wanted to know the patient's name. They wanted to know if he had a disability and if he could communicate. They fired question after question rather relentlessly. It made the doctor quite irritated. So, she scolded them for trying to make someone else's tragedy into their entertainment. She then asked the police how these people even got into the building. They were causing such a nuisance, and all of their access passes should be checked. All these reporters would be reported for obstruction and trespassing. Well, that finally got rid of them. Things got a bit quiet after that, and the only sound was the drip in the hospital. The main character lay in bed, resting and recuperating. After a while, he opened one eye and stared out at the white room that held him. He stared at that big white fluorescent bulb, with a lot of ideas in his head. Stretching out his hand, the boy's mind was flooded with more and more ideas. Suddenly, he heard a sound, and the boy looked up. There was another patient in the room using their phone. It was an older gentleman, and he noticed the youth staring at him. He had already heard the story, and he knew the boy was kidnapped. The poor child had a rough life, and he felt sorry for him because he knew the child's life would be tough due to his extra disabilities. The boy stared silently at the old man for a while, but he could see the name and all the information about the other patient that was placed by the man's bed. He even knew the guy's height and weight. Just by looking at the man, he could tell that he was left-handed and constantly dehydrated because of his dry skin. The man was oblivious to this as he was busy having a lot of fun just using his phone. The man had no watch marks or rings, so he clearly worked a physical job and had no spouse. Putting all of these pieces together, the youth could detect that his roommate was probably doing some plastering work on a low rooftop and fell. As he fell, the left-handed brain instinctively directed his left foot to land first, but the femur couldn't withstand the force of the impact and shattered, protruding outwards. The main character could imagine the man's scream of pain like he'd been there to witness the accident. He could even guess the most appropriate first aid in that situation. However, his thoughts were interrupted when the female doctor returned. She had brought him some food and asked if he'd gotten some rest. She knew he must be hungry, and she'd brought a fork and spoon for him to use. Meanwhile, her patient was busy analyzing her. The boy thought that the doctor was a man, and he noticed the doctor's drooping eyes and crow's feet at the edges. The boy also noticed how their cheek muscles lifted upwards, and noticed the symmetrical smile. It was a genuine smile and a sign that this man did not see him as a threat. The doctor handed him the spoon and encouraged him to eat as much as he wanted. No one would scold him. The boy was shocked by it and stared at more food than he'd ever been given in captivity. The boy gulped, and the doctor explained that it was hospital food, so it might not taste great, but she still encouraged him to eat a lot. Well, the boy gripped his cutlery and got busy. He scarfed down that food like it was the Hunger Games, abandoning the food at some point and just using his hands. The doctor and the other patient were in shock at how fast he was eating. The doctor had to tell him to slow down or he'd choke. However, the boy had no intention of slowing down, and he just kept chowing down. He ate those plates clean and even started picking up the little grains of rice. The doctor was horrified, wondering just how this poor child had been able to survive all this time. She got a call, and she picked up the phone to greet the caller. Apparently, the boy's family had arrived. It seemed they'd been able to locate the boy's relatives. The doctor excitedly told the youth that his mum and dad were here. The youth calculated her eager smile. He recognized the titles of mom and dad. The people who had come should be his family. The doctor happily told him that the doctor would bring them soon. The youth watched the doctor leave in awe, speechless as she left. Time passed in the silence, and he wondered how long it would take for his parents to reach him. He started counting the seconds and then the minutes. Suddenly, a voice said that it would make sure that the main character could hear them. The boy was confused as his senses became even clearer. His eyes widened as his brain activity intensified. He kept thinking, and he listened closely, watching the movement outside the door. His eyes widened as the people came closer. He could hear them now. He could hear the very step of the person's heel on the floor. That sound traveled all the way to his hospital bed. It was like a sound arrow speeding right to him. The boy's eyes widened as his hearing suddenly got so much better, and suddenly everything sounded so much louder. The patient's stability was their top priority. They needed to make sure that he was not startled. The boy was speechless as he listened, and then they were getting ready to come in. His eyes widened, and he stared at the people who came inside. A woman and a man. Their faces brightened with smiles when they saw him, calling him Woojin. They rushed to him, calling him their son, even though the doctor had told them not to startle the poor boy. The boy stared at the two people coming in close with their arms open for large hugs. It surprised the main character to be embraced by a loving mother and a joyous father. The woman was pretty, so she looked a little like him, and he had his father's hair. They both celebrated saving their beautiful child, crying their apologies for not keeping him safe. They were grateful that he was unharmed and thanked him for coming back. Their cries and love and adoration were loud, so loud in Woojin's ear that he finally got overstimulated and pulled away from them in pain. The boy covered his ears, staring at them in fear as they asked him what was wrong. They were concerned, asking if he was okay, but the noise they were making felt overwhelming, and the boy cried out. It was loud. The sobbing, the crying, the shouts of joy and relief at seeing their son. All of this noise was much too loud for the little boy, who had just regained his sense of hearing. The sky was bright and blue over a brown apartment complex, and it was a bright new day in a new